Radio in Africa was the exclusive preserve of governments.
Radio is very much, to my mind, an explanatory medium.
Welcome to Season 3 of Free Speak and this first episode for 2022. World Radio Day is around the corner and the theme for this year is Radio and Trust. The entire journalistic world is currently battling with the issue of public trust, and so it is fitting that this key question is the focus of 2022 World Radio Day, which is celebrated globally on February 13. It's a particularly important issue for a medium regarded as the most powerful in Africa, accessing the widest audiences, especially in areas where newspapers and the internet don't reach. While the use of the internet and social media as news sources are expanding on the continent, according to the Afrobarometer survey, radio still tops the list. It's also a media that was for many decades under the control of governments across the continent, but the Windhoek Declaration of 1991 and the African Charter on Broadcasting facilitated the opening of the airwaves. Today, the broadcasting industry is as diverse as it is impactful. But is radio trusted by the majority of listeners? And if not, how to forge that trust is a leading question. I've got two great guests with me today, Norah Appolus, the Grand Dame of radio in Namibia, if I may call her that. And I do recall being interviewed by Norah back in the 80s for Radio France International. At the time, I was a correspondent for the BBC, which I do remember those times with great fondness. And she's also a broadcast trainer par excellence. My second guest is one of the shining lights in the radio landscape in Namibia, and he is David Bishop, head of news at Future Media, also an experienced broadcaster. So welcome to you both. I'm Gwen Lister, host of the Free Speak podcast, in which we discuss all things media. Norah, if I may start with you. You've got decades-long experience in media, not only here in Namibia, but further afield too. Has radio in Africa changed for the better in the intervening years, in the transition to open airwaves?
Thank you, Gwen. Undoubtedly so, obviously. Look, when I started out in radio about 40 years ago, radio in Africa was the exclusive preserve of governments, of African governments. I remember even as a child growing up in Zambia, way before I went to university, etc., as a child growing up in Zambia. The only radio broadcasting allowed on the airwaves was the national broadcaster, or the state broadcaster, Zambia National Broadcasting Corporation. So it has always been the preserve of governments in Africa. Now, obviously, the airwaves have opened up to hundreds of different players, both in the private and commercial radio sectors. Now, this development has also been important for the advent of democracy, for the transition to democracy in most African countries. So that is important. However, while it is a welcome development, it has its inherent dangers, and we will come to that.
Right, exactly. That's a good point, Norah, and we will explore that as well. David, just to follow up with you, given that radio is the most powerful medium, even in this digital era, do you think it is rising to the challenge of providing the audience with news that they can use?
I think it is. I think radio is very much, to my mind, an explanatory medium. So it has the ability to dig a little bit deeper and to explain, and often in explain it in terms that the layman can understand. So I think especially now with COVID-19, with not the advent of, but the acceleration of fake news, I think their radio has come to the fore in many ways, because it has the ability to explain, to dig a little bit deeper, to debunk a lot of that fake news.
Okay.
I think Obviously, the day-to-day news that people require, I think radio does still provide that as well, and is able to provide that in a very accessible format.
Right. And it's very immediate as well.
Yeah.
Which, of course, where it differs with print and legacy media, basically.
Yeah, if I can just come in there,
Certainly,
I totally
Norah.
agree with David that in this era of fake news on social platforms, wherever, people tend to refer first to radio and other tried and tested, stations,
Right.
to see if this news is real. So radio is playing an important part there.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that, because definitely to debunk a lot of the disinformation that so proliferates on social media. Yes. Norah, perhaps just to follow up on that, what are your perceptions on where radio stands vis-a-vis the trust of the audience? Do you think private radio is more trusted than state broadcasters, for example, or is it the reverse, or does it differ from country to country?
Well, it depends. Look, in Western Europe, where I worked for many years,
Right.
I'd say that the national broadcasters, your BBC, your Radio France International, etc., especially the Scandinavian countries, those are more trusted simply because they have a very strict code of conduct. The journalists are skilled, they're experienced, and they're ethical. So basically, they are more trusted. But in Africa, hell no.
Is that because, Norah, could I interrupt there? Is that because of the divide between public broadcasters, which probably are phrases that apply to Radio France International, BBC and Scandinavian, as opposed to state broadcasters? Is that where the problem comes?
That is, well, yes, when you look at it, but the problem is the control, the tight grip that governments have on the airwaves. In state-owned broadcasters, they like to call themselves national broadcasters.
Exactly, yeah.
But
Bit of
okay,
a
national
euphemism,
in the
but
yes,
anyway.
national in the sense that yes, they're owned by government. It's national, but the grip that they have on what goes out on the airwaves is what is causing them to be viewed by the public with suspicion, derision. They are sometimes called his or her master's voice,
Right.
For obvious reasons. And it is because of this tight grip and the influence that they exert, overtly or covertly, that they or sometimes subtle or blatant. And it is because of this influence that they exert. And this has led, unfortunately, to self-censorship on the part of these journalists, which is sad because it compromises the quality of programs.
Absolutely. Norah, before I turn to David, just to add on to that, the thing is, though, that these state broadcasters are still very powerful in the rural areas.
Yes.
So, and they are obviously the go-to, especially if you look in the Namibian context, your private radio is stronger, I think, in the cities and urban areas, whereas it's really in the rural areas where people need that information so desperately.
That's where their strength is. And when in terms of the popularity, rankings, the public broadcaster, the national broadcaster, is way above the rest because they reach
that penetration.
Exactly, and they reach the most number of people, particularly in the rural areas.
Yeah.
And the language group because they broadcast in their languages.
That's also
so
true.
Obviously they reach, the private and commercial, urban-based.
Right,
and
exactly.
mainly geared for the youth.
David, anything you'd like to add there?
I was going to say the reach is definitely a factor, and the different sort of socio-economic stratifications will, as Norah said, influence the trust levels. What I'm sort of seeing in the discourse, let's sort of say amongst the rising educated classes in Namibia, is that sort of skepticism of government media, of national radio stations, but also, and I'm glad for it, a healthy skepticism even of the private commercial radio stations, commercial media, people are being able to sort of look at that as well and say, but, you know, are you also 100% impartial, or are you choosing your stories based on certain commercial interests, perhaps? And I mean, that's why it's very important in any organization to have that very definite divide between your editorial content and your sort of sales team, to say.
Exactly. And another issue may be, of course, critically, David, we won't dwell on it here, but the issue which is so applicable at the moment also to print media is the issue of ownership. Who owns it? What are the agendas behind it? A lot of the public, when they don't know whether to trust that news or not. So that's another consideration that maybe calls for more transparency in the radio sector.
Definitely.
So people know who they're listening to and what it represents. But as a follow-up to the earlier point, David, in print media, we are seeing a surge towards investigative journalism, particularly as newspapers try to realign themselves under threat. But this has never been the forte of radio. Any comment from you on whether this is something that could happen in the broadcast media in the future, or is it difficult to do?
I think it is possible. I'm not 100% certain in the Namibian context. I mean, traditionally, private radio, specifically in Namibia, has been very much entertainment driven. We don't have very strong talk stations.
Correct.
South Africa goes a little bit further. They do have the Cape Talks and the 702s, but even there, they are limited. They're not necessarily pure talk. And I mean, I've seen instances overseas where radio stations have successfully done investigative work and broken those kinds of stories. It just depends, as I say, in a Namibian context, resource-wise, time-wise, and what the audience actually consumes radio here for. Yeah, I'm not sure people tuning into an entertainment station will necessarily welcome a hard news hour where you dig very deeply into a story. But I don't see why we can't do certain elements of investigative reporting. So maybe not a massive WikiLeaks style, or, you know, ICIJ, am I getting the acronym
in depth, right? Absolutely.
Yeah, those
Panama
sorts
Papers.
Of Panama Papers stories. But radio can dig into the smaller, and I mean, tying in there to the idea that all journalism is investigative journalism, digging into the local issues, especially for the smaller community stations. And I know there was training done a couple of years ago for people working for the community stations to allow them to figure out how to dig into their local stories, how to hold their councillors to account. So a different type of investigative journalism, sure, but the sort of big in-depth Panama Papers style,
it's not possible.
Not really. Well, not in the foreseeable future.
It's maybe an area worth exploring, though, especially neither of you obviously represent the community radio sector. But when you think of Omaheke Radio based in a certain community, that it should be looking at the issues that are so badly affecting those communities, whether it be the drought or whether it be corruption or whatever, that there is scope perhaps for a slightly more diverse bouquet, if you like, for listeners. And given that radio is still so strong and so influential in terms of access to information, the potential would seem to be unlimited.
I think one of the main problems here, why we don't have investigative journalism on our airwaves, is it actually, particularly on the public broadcaster, because with its resources and its reach, you know, it should be, and it can come up with these insightful programs. But the problem, and this is across the board, is the skills.
Skills and maybe the expense, Norah, of content creation in terms
well,
of...
there is an expense. There would be an expense for the private sector, obviously, because it is expensive. You know, there would be. There would also obviously be expenses for the public broadcaster, because they're also under pressure, you know, financially.
Sure.
So there is that. But they have correspondents in the various regions. They've got radio stations in all the regions. So, you know, their expenses can be managed, you know, properly in terms of gathering content
Right.
for investigative journalism.
Right. But the skills level is inhibiting that, would you say?
That is the main problem.
Okay.
That
That's
is the
interesting.
main problem, even with the private radio stations.
it's
I have
similar.
listened to them, and, cringe, basically.
The thing is, and I was going to mention it
Skills.
later, a lot of people are attracted, young people, to radio because they see themselves as DJs, right? And making names for themselves and sort of going off into the entertainment industry, seeing that as a stepping stone and not for serious journalism. So that's maybe something that needs to be looked at in the future.
I mean, and I think it starts really with our tertiary institutions, and they are supposed to be the launch pad for these journalists. Okay, but when you listen to their radio stations, the entire programming is nothing but DJs.
Right, exactly.
And these are supposed to be training, journalists, supposed to be a platform for training journalists. Right. Just listen to them. It's nothing but music and DJs. And as you say, a lot of the young people, especially the urban youth,
right,
and unfortunately the rural youth are copying this as well because they think it's hip and they want to move into
part of that.
But they are being deprived of real quality, incisive programs.
And certainly some opportunities lost. But,
Yes.
Maybe I don't know, but having a little to do with some of the community stations, some better than others, seem to be trying to do a bit more, train their people, get them sort of conscious of local issues and not just play music all the time. David, do you want to chip in there before we...
I think a lot of the problem is almost that being a DJ is seen as an easy job.
Exactly.
That's sort of how it's sold in the pop culture elements of it, that, and perhaps I was guilty of that back as an 18-year-old as well, getting into radio. You can, arrive, make a cup of coffee and sit down and talk nonsense for 3 hours. But the understanding of what actually goes into a successful radio show and the fact that you need to research and be well read and know what you're speaking about. So that's why training and mentorship becomes very important. But obviously there again, radio, I think, is also limited in a way, much like the newspapers are, with the sort of the skills loss as people are. If I think back to the old days of radio in Namibia, how many of those people are still actually in the industry, and how many of them have moved on to greener pastures, let's say, working in PR or working in government or any of those. So you're losing those skills and you're losing those mentorship opportunities. And that to me is where it's very, very important, is to be able to get the youth who are energetic and want to be in radio, because to me that's very important. I've gone to you go to the schools and everyone wants to be a lawyer or a doctor because they can earn big money. I mean, I always wanted to work in radio. That was my passion. So to not see that amongst the youth is disheartening to me. But in the people that, or where there is that passion and where they do want to become a DJ, to then be able to take that person and mentor them and mold them and sort of show them that given the work, they can become exceptional.
Exactly. And I mean, there is such hope for and scope for youth who do want to go into media, but again, there seems to be this reluctance, unless, as you say. And then I'm wondering whether a lot of the youth aren't, or even the radio station management at times, looking at how, for example, newspapers are trying to reinvent themselves and compete with the social media, that they resort to sort of clickbait. How do we get people to listen to our station? Let's talk about sex. Or do you know what I mean? Is that that sort of infotainment focus?
Definitely an element. And I've seen South African radio stations sort of being accused of hiring, instead of looking for good DJ talent, they're more interested in content creator, influencer type. Someone has a massive following on social media, and I've seen it reported in the States as well, where someone's being hired based on what following they can bring to the radio station.
So that influencer type
on
thing.
social media. And obviously, I mean, that will then also influence the type of content that person creates and the type of content that goes out on the radio, and you will end up with those sort of clickbait type stories and sensationalism.
Exactly.
Precisely, and as Gwen was saying, here in Namibia in particular, ownership is extremely important because some owners, and there is a case in point in
Yes,
Namibia.
I think we know what it is. Yes.
Precisely.
Before you
So,
mentioned
some
it.
owners have hidden agendas, or
Right.
open agendas,
Right.
it's not so hidden, based on the content that they play on their stations. And it is absolutely horrendous. It is so sensational. It beggars belief.
Right.
You know, and this is where the danger is as well. And the fact that there isn't a body or an institution that should actually be calling them to order, to say, guys, what you are doing is not journalism. It's a disservice.
The Editors Forum is there, but
Yes.
the NBC, for example, and I think certain private radio are members, but that doesn't. It's not as you say, some sort of
It
regulatory.
has no teeth.
It's the voluntary aspect of it.
Yes,
that the
exactly.
people that we are speaking about without naming aren't members of the EFN, so they're not
Exactly.
beholden to the policies and the agreements
Exactly.
and the code of conduct that the EFN puts
Precisely.
out.
And it's a lot of popular
ultimately,
stuff that
yeah,
gets a
and
bit of a
yes.
following, which is unfortunate.
Precisely,
in some,
because they like the sensationalist nonsense that
Sure.
you know is put out there, and if we are not careful, if we don't regulate ourselves,
Right.
and if we don't strictly adhere to an internationally accepted code of conduct and ethics, we are going to be regulated by government.
Right. That's
Sooner or
always
later.
the sort of sword of Damocles.
Exactly. There's always
hanging
this
over
sword
our
hanging
heads.
over our heads, you know, guys. And now, obviously, with governments being pressured to open up the airwaves and to allow free speech, this is like taking it a bit too far.
Yeah,
You know,
I
it
get
is,
you.
yeah.
Yeah.
It goes back to the mentorship and training again, but also then, as you're saying, it brings in that other element of it depends on the company itself. Do they have strict guidelines in place? Do they do the because again we've got the difference between a DJ and a journalist. So the person putting out the news on the station, you know, as opposed to the person who's just talking about the news on the station, and the fact that they need to actually be held to the same standard.
Exactly.
But it's up to the company to enforce that and to make sure that they have a stringent set of guidelines for their DJs, for their journalists. This is what you can cover. This is how you can cover that. But like Norah says, when everybody's struggling and you're looking for some kind of income, sometimes depending on the company, it's easier to say, go for it.
Absolutely.
Let's cause a little. Let's get some people talking
Stir
about
it up.
us.
Yeah.
But I think that the issuing authority that issues the licenses, I think should be a bit more stringent in who it gives the licenses to. You know, for heaven's sakes, if you want to issue a broadcasting license, there must be a minimum, you know, of requirement. Exactly. You know, one, you've got to be journalists, and two, you know, whatever experience, but you can't just issue it to business people and,
Anybody
I woke
who
up
wants
this morning
to
and I
have a
decide I want to
megaphone.
have, you know, a radio station.
Right.
Hello.
Yeah. Norah, just let's step back briefly to the question of state broadcasters or national broadcasters, as say they're also called. Obviously, the African Charter recommended the move from state to public broadcasters, but most governments on the continent are obviously slow to give up those controls, and we know why. But if we even look at the Namibian context, doesn't this also, and I know David also wants to speak to this, give the state broadcaster a bit of a monopoly? I mean, if we look at the issue here of the NBC holding on to a whole lot of licenses and things like that, what is it creating unfair competition because they are so dominant? Perhaps you, Norah, and then David take up the...
Well, yes, it does give the national broadcaster state an unfair advantage.
Right.
In the sense that in this world where the pie is so small, they get double the pie. First of all, they taxed by the taxpayers. They use taxpayers' money through the government grants. And secondly, they are also free to go to look for advertising.
And compete with the commercial. Exactly.
Exactly.
And can undercut the commercial.
Correct.
And yes, absolutely. You know, not only that, their reach is much wider. So therefore, they reach a larger audience, and this is what speaks to the advertisers.
Absolutely.
Your reach,
who sometimes want to curry favor with the government for obvious reasons. So that, David, any just brief comments on that?
In terms of another element of it from a sort of journalistic perspective is access. And that the national broadcaster, to my mind, seems to have a greater access to ministers, to voices. I understand cultivating your own contact list, but we've seen in the past where it has definitely been unspoken, but sort of, I need to speak to the NBC first, and then I can speak to you.
Exactly.
Which, and that definitely creates a
different
element of unfair.
where the politicians don't start until the NBC pitches up. But yes, things like that. David, thanks for that. You know, what could be termed hate radio, we know it's always been a concern on the continent, especially when we look at its role in Rwanda during the genocide. Do you think, and we've touched on it briefly, the sort of infotainment aspects of radio, do you think this is a problem here today? Are some of them sailing a bit close to the edge in terms of either salacious or dangerous or insightful or clickbait content to compete with social media? Do you think it's a problem or not yet?
There have been elements where I've seen it and where it could have become problematic. I think, thankfully, whether it's just a Namibian situation, a lot of the time it got diffused quite quickly or it disappeared. But there again, it's very important, and it takes us back to the ownership structures and the control levels and the guidelines that are in place for people. Whereas, sometimes things are just said by accident, and then they can be cleaned up quite quickly.
Right.
Sometimes things, I don't think we've necessarily got the issue of necessarily outright sort of hate and attack. I've seen a lot more of that on social media, which you won't be able to be regulated. But from a radio point of view, I think some of the times, yes, maybe you become a bit salacious, you become a bit sensationalist because you want some interaction with the audience, you want somebody to comment on your Facebook post, and that can take it a little bit far sometimes. But I don't think we've got the problem in the radio context of it bordering or crossing over onto hate.
I totally agree with David. With the exception of this one or two radio stations that I was talking about earlier, but even they don't go so far as
to incite,
exactly,
tribalism,
precisely, to what we would call hate speech. No, they don't.
Okay, so I mean, obviously, it's a good thing for us all to keep note. The warning signs are there, because if we look at social media and what's carrying on these days, and people, really stirring it up in terms of xenophobia and so on, that we just need to be aware of that. But I mean, it's not a problem per se.
I think in terms of the commercial entertainment function of most of the Namibian radio stations, it's not actually in their interest to rile their listeners up too much. That's not what the people are tuning into them for. You're tuning into an entertainment station for entertainment, for a little bit of a lighter mood, not to be worked up. And I think to that extent, I think any radio station that perhaps wanted to go that way would almost be shooting themselves in the foot a bit.
Right. And this brings me back to our question of trust, which is really what we're talking about today. And I'm wondering whether, obviously, trust of the audience depends, very largely speaking, yes, issues like ownership and the policy of the stations have a role to play, but it clearly depends on, and Norah said that already, so have you, David, on skilled and dedicated radio journalists who know their job, who basically are journalists. And Norah, of course, has a lot to do with training people. Where do we and how do we, Norah, I know it's probably a question that keeps you up at night, how do we get these young people to really take it seriously? Because as you say, I get that feeling that even while, and I do a lot of mentoring of journalists as well, that while you're doing it, they've got the eye on becoming a PR for a big company here or to go into marketing there, and journalism isn't their end goal. So how do we get them to get back to reading and do things that are going to make them more skilled, and in turn get people to really listen in, and for people to be truthfully informed, or as informed as possible through this very powerful medium. Where do we go, Norah? What are your ideas, if any?
Tough call. Look, when I have trained journalists, broadcast journalists, a lot of the time, obviously, I will ask them, why are you in this?
Right.
And what drives you? What is your passion? I found that a lot of them want to go on television and they want to be on TV,
Anchors.
it's a celebrity.
Yeah.
And obviously, this is the influence of what they see, in America, Hollywood, etc., where they become celebrities.
Right.
And this is what drives a lot of them. The few really dedicated journalists that I've been working with, that I've worked with, have really been journalists and are willing to learn and are willing to push the boundaries. However, once they get to working in for instance, the national broadcaster, they're hamstrung by
The policies and
the management,
Right.
their editors, etc., because of this fear factor.
right. So they're
Exactly.
inhibited, and
Precisely,
the fear factor and all those, yes, self-censorship. Yeah.
Absolutely, which is really, really sad. So we need a crop of fearless journalists who are willing to push the boundary and are willing to do real journalism and not pander to, whoever.
The powers that
precisely.
be. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. David, last thoughts from you on that?
I think Norah, having mentioned the tertiary institutions earlier, and I think they're, as much as commercial entities are limited at the moment, everybody's struggling, they don't have the resources, but some kind of partnership with the tertiary institutions that can, have more of a training element. And I know you've spoken to it before, that the tertiary institutions don't actually make use of the resources that are available in Namibia, but get that partnership going, that people who have been in the industry for years, that have the experience, can come and talk to the students themselves. We all know,
And inspire them, you
Yeah,
need
there's-
role models.
there's a big difference between your lecturer telling you something and someone who's there doing it
Absolutely.
day to day, telling you that, and possibly inspiring and lighting that fire inside you. So if we could sort of work more on those partnerships and helping to train, offering up our time, I think that would definitely be beneficial.
Okay, it's nice to hear. Even in a rather depressing scenario, there
Yes.
is positivity, and there are
total
those
hope.
good young people out there who are going to be stars one day, but they're just a little too few and far between. So finally, just to wrap up this podcast, I'm afraid we don't have the time I'd like to have to chat to the both of you. But again, with World Radio Day here, just a few thoughts from the both of you to sum up really your thinking on the issue of trust in radio, and where we can go from here, whether it be commercial, community, state, national broadcaster, to enhance the already significant power of this medium in terms of making information accessible to people. Just some last thoughts. Norah, you go first.
I think, as far as I'm concerned, for me, the main issue would be that these radio stations must provide content that is relevant to the communities that they broadcast to, relevant to their audiences. And once they are, and they are adequately informed, you will have a captive audience.
That's a good point. And also make use of other mediums like podcasts and things, so people listening in the car on the way to work or in the village can also hear discussions like this one. Might be nice. David, last thoughts from you.
Well, I think radio's got the benefit in that it is that more intimate medium, and you are sharing people's lives with them. You're there with them while they're doing the dishes or cooking dinner at night, or taking the kids to school, whatever it is. So that allows us, I think, the the opportunity to gain trust in ways that other mediums don't necessarily have, but it also gives us a massive responsibility that we have to live up to that trust.
Right. That's a good point. And I mean, to conclude, I think radio is still a very vibrant sector in Namibia. And to me, it looks like what is important going forward is possibly, Norah, also, as you say, there are limited people out there like David working where he is and you working where you are to sort of pool our skills, whether it's commercial, whether it's national broadcaster, whether it is a private radio, just to actually pool their skills and expertise and put it together and start thinking more creatively about going forward and not only building trust, but also maintaining the status quo, where radio at the moment still is a lot stronger in terms of sustainability than print, for example, and maintaining and enhancing this position.
It's absolutely imperative that we've got to work together, not for us per se, but for our audiences, for the people of this country, and providing them with quality programs and content.
Thank you very much, Norah. Thank you, David, for taking time. And happy New Year.
Thank you.